Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a Ukraine war news update, third part thereof for the 27th of June 2025. This is a geopolitical update concerning the war in Ukraine. We're going to start with Zelensky saying important results of the European Council meeting. So he went to this European Council meeting, got a great sort of rapturous applause as he entered. I reported on that yesterday. He said there are really good decisions on security support, further pressure on Russia, and a high assessment of our internal transformation. Now everything depends on us, on the unity of the EU member states. So he was really buoyed up from that. And kind of that leads us on to a number of other things, not least that the EU have now pretty much finished. It's the end of the beginning for Ukraine's accession. And they've done everything correctly. And now basically going to start proper accession talks, which is fantastic. We'll also talk about Moldova as well, going for accession talks. So that's really good news for Moldova. Right, EU leaders have agreed to extend sanctions against Russia for another 6 months. So these sanctions go for 6 months at a time, and then they keep having to renew them. They didn't seem to have too much problem renewing the sanctions when it comes to people like Hungary and Slovakia, but when they try and put new sanctions on, that's when they seem to have a problem. So there's a big sigh of relief as they got those sanctions extended, but unfortunately, as it says here, Antonio Costa confirmed work continues on the 18th sanctions package. EU Commission also supports opening accession talks with Ukraine. So, okay, before we get to the 18th package, the 17th package that has already sort of been and gone, if you like. Actually, Norway's, because Norway are not a proper member of the EU, they've got this kind of weird relationship with the EU. In fact, it was one of the models that the UK was thinking about taking on, but we, in the end, went for a hard Brexit. We were talking about doing Norway Plus and all sorts of things, but in the end, we just cut loose. And now we're like, oh, can we have a closer relationship, please? So anyway, Norway is taking on the 17th package against Russia, targeting 200 Shadow Fleet vessels and entities aiding the Russian military. Foreign Minister Epson Bart Ida called it a vital contribution to Europe's pressure on Moscow over its war of aggression. EU leaders have extended the existing sanctions, but failed to... Now we hear they failed to approve the proposed 18th package. This was earlier, according to actually yesterday. It was initially announced by Radio Liberty, but I think it's kind of an ongoing thing. It keeps the way I understand it is, no, it hasn't happened. Okay, and then it gets reported it hasn't happened, but the talks are still ongoing. Then no, it still hasn't happened. So Slovakia apparently withheld its support, even though they were the ones that said, we'll do it if we can have some concessions on, payback if it hurts us type thing. But they cited concerns yesterday over post-2027 gas supplies. And this is a bit of a surprise. People weren't expecting, though, Slovakia to be so difficult. But now we just hear, this is TVP World reporting that European leaders failed to agree the latest 18th package of sanctions on Russia during the European Council meeting in Brussels, with Hungary and Slovakia holding firm in their opposition to the proposed measures. So I presume those discussions will keep going on. Macron did say that in the next few days, the European Union is expected to adopt the 18th sanctions package, unprecedented in its ambition and its measures to contains in the financial and energy sectors. It will impose an embargo, notably on imports of Russian crude oil refined in third countries, which is a strong signal. And I hope that this agreement will also include the principle of lowering the cap price on Russian crude oil. It's important to pass it because it is a very deterrent package that will have an impact on the Russian economy and will probably bring Russia back to the negotiating table. So it's thought to be, well, it evidently is would be a very strong package against Russia, but unfortunately, Hungary and Slovakia again. Ursula von der Leyen calls to... So more on that, no doubt, over the next few days. I presume they're going to keep negotiating over it. It's not like, well, that's done. Ursula von der Leyen calls to start EU accession talks with Ukraine. So this is what I was mentioning earlier. Kiev has fulfilled all of its obligations despite the war and constant shelling, said the head of the European Commission. That's why Brussels supports opening the first cluster of accession negotiations. Actually, Antonio Costa, I think during the kind of NATO summit talks was speaking to Zelensky about how amazingly Ukraine had done in achieving all of their objectives in terms of acceding to the EU. So that's really fantastic. Hungarian Prime Minister Orban claims his country has stopped Ukraine's EU accession with over 2 million votes in the Vox 2025 referendum. 95% opposed it, according to the government. So if you remember, he said, "I'm going to put this idea of the EU, the Ukrainian accession to the EU." To my peeps. And he did a referendum, and he was caught signing that referendum himself. Not caught, he was photographed signing that referendum himself. And everyone's thinking, well, I was certainly thinking, yeah, I wonder how this one's going to turn out. This is going to be one hell of a rigged election. Now it turns out that 95% voted against Ukraine joining. Now, if you know anything about referendums, you never get 95% unless you are a dictatorship and you're someone like Syria. Oh, I wonder who's going to vote for Bashar al-Assad. Oh, it turns out 95% of you do. Like 95% is a ridiculously high proportion of votes. So all I can say is that there's definitely something dodgy going on with that. In fact, most people appear to be assuming that this was pretty rigged. Orban questions Ukraine's current borders and identity, arguing ex-Soviet states join NATO first for security before they join the EU. But of course, he's already said they can't join NATO. So Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, stated that Ukraine is an undefined entity and that it should not be admitted into NATO. There you go. You've got to join NATO first before you join the EU. Can we join NATO? No, you can't. You've got to join the EU first before you join NATO. Okay, EU, can we join? No, you've got to join NATO first before you join the EU. And so on and so forth. Ukrainians, through no fault of their own, are an undefined entity. We don't even know what Ukraine is today or the extent of its borders. Oh, jeez. Hungary has announced that, as mentioned, 95% of respondents oppose Ukraine's accession, according to the results of that Vox 25. Government claims that 2.28 million citizens participated in the vote, and the result is non-binding. So there is that, I guess. So what else do we have? Slovak Prime Minister's advisor was brought to Moscow by a foundation that recruits foreigners for Russian military intelligence. David Lindner's March visit on behalf of the Slovakian government was organised by Russian State Duma MP Leonid Slutsky, on behalf of the GRU-linked Russian Peace Foundation, to which Kiev typically says, and you wonder why only one guy blocked the entire European Union from applying Russian sanctions package today. This was actually yesterday when Slovakia had done that. Slovakian government is a Russian-occupied entity. Now Putin aims to do the same with Czechia a few months from now, so slightly worrying about the Czechia elections, the Czech elections. Australia has imposed anti-Russian sanctions against 37 individuals and 7 organisations, according to their Ministry of Foreign Affairs in total. Since March 2014, the Australian government has announced the introduction of anti-Russian restrictions more than 30 times, mate. Look, that's bloody brilliant. Thanks, Australia. Really, really appreciate it. Or something. The EU's top diplomat, Kaja Kallas, did not rule out that Canada could become a member of the European Union. At the same time, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said that at this moment, Canada has no such intentions, but who knows how things will turn out in the future, ... So Kaja Kallas looking very smiley there. It seems to be very upbeat. In fact, the Canadians and the Europeans are getting on famously well at the moment. They've just done a defence pact as Canada moves inexorably away from the United States and towards Europe. In fact, Mark Carney was saying the other day when he was interviewed by Christiane Amanpour that we are the most European of other nations outside of Europe type thing. Ukrainians who fled to the UK after the Russian invasion are being refused asylum by the Home Office on the grounds it is safe to return to Ukraine, reports The Guardian. They have been refused asylum on grounds they could relocate elsewhere in Ukraine despite their hometown being a war zone. I actually agree with this. Like, I don't know if you find that controversial. And I've thought this for a long time, actually. I don't think there is particularly a need for Ukrainians to seek asylum on the basis of war, because I think there are plenty of places in Ukraine that are safe enough to live without the threat of war. Now, this does depend on the front lines being somewhat stable, as in they're not likely to collapse and then suddenly all of Ukraine is going to be taken over. I just think that's completely unrealistic. So I actually agree with this, and I actually also think it will be more useful for Ukraine if Ukrainians remain in Ukraine for purposes of fighting and supporting the economy, and I just don't think it is unduly dangerous There are, if you're going to go and live right next to Staro Konstantinov Air Base, then you probably got a few issues. But there are plenty, and you're not going to want to live near the front lines and in the Donbass. But there are plenty of places you can live. Now, I'm prepared to be proved wrong on this. Let me know what you think. I know Bertolt often takes me to task on certain claims about migration and refugees more pertinently. But actually, I think this makes sense from the UK. Putin is to skip the Brexit summit in Brazil due to the International Criminal Court arrest warrant that is on him for child deportation. That's good news. So it looks like it's going to be Sergei Lavrov going to Brazil, because Brazil would, as a signatory to the Rome Statute, be obliged to arrest him. This happened previously when it was in South Africa. Putin is overstretched. Russia withdraws forces from Kaliningrad, Poland says. So as Russia tries to form new units near Finland, its forces are being stretched thin, prompting a major withdrawal from Kaliningrad, Poland's foreign minister says. So Radoslav Sikorski here. Let's go into a little bit more detail here from Divana. Russia retreats from Kaliningrad. The empire stretches too thin. Moscow is quietly withdrawing troops from Kaliningrad, the once feared military outpost between NATO states, so it's an exclave. Officially, so let's just have a look at where it is here. You have Kaliningrad there, and you've got this gap between Russia and Russia, and indeed Belarus and Russia. So that gap, the Slovakia gap there, is particularly vulnerable to... Well, there are people in that area, I believe, that are actually moving away from that area because they're afraid something might happen. Anyway, they claim it's to de-escalate tensions ahead of the Zapad 2025 drills, but the truth is more humiliating. They're running out of soldiers, says this source. Polish Foreign Minister Radoslav Sikorski confirms that Russia has significantly reduced its military presence in the exclave. Lithuanian sources have already spotted troops redeployed to the Kursk region in 2024. The war in Ukraine is bleeding the empire dry. Kaliningrad, the Kremlin's western dagger, long meant to threaten the Baltics and Poland, is now dulling. Its geography, once seen as a strategic asset, is turning into a liability. A half-isolated enclave can no longer, or exclave, can no longer be the hammer of Russian intimidation. Just as Hitler stretched his front too wide and Napoleon bled in the vastness of the East, Russia is losing the illusion of invincibility one battalion at a time. So PS, and you can see the Baltics' entry into NATO de-escalates the front, not the other way round. I agree with this, even according to the Russian Federation, because the Russian Federation is an aggressor and they are still afraid to attack NATO. Now, Western sanctions are crushing Putin's shadow fleet of oil tankers, says Robin Brooks, and he produced a similar one the other day. We live track volumes of 343 shadow fleet ships, most of which are now sanctioned. Activity levels have collapsed in the wake of last month's wave of EU and UK sanctions. This is really good news, and it's why they need to that 18th set of sanctions, and why the US needs to come on board as well for another set of sanctions, because they work. This is hurting Russia to the point now Putin, for the first time, has personally recognized the problems in the economy. He said that Russia's defense spending is $172 billion. He said, quote, "That's a lot. We pay for it with inflation, but we are now fighting this inflation. I think the spending figures are grossly understated, and that the situation with the Russian economy," says Gerashenko, "has really deteriorated a lot. That means that additional sanctions are necessary." I agree there, but there's an admission from Putin that, things are a little bit troubling. There's more detail in what he says, but that's just the synopsis there. Zelensky has said that Czech firms are arming Russia. The Insider, which is a news outlet, finds at least 12 exporters supplied machines via Turkey, Serbia, and more. Tools from top manufacturers entered Russia even in 2024, data shows. And problems, still these loopholes, still these, or I don't know if it's loopholes or people breaking the law, actually. Now, goodness me, right, Russia continues to pour migrants into the UK, providing transportation and artificial documents. Aimed at gaining support for far-right political parties, Russia has expanded the program across Europe. Now, there were claims that Russia was doing this with both Finland and Poland, and through Belarus as well. Throwing in, or not throwing in, but motivating migrants to cross the border. So you have a lot of these sometimes African migrants coming into Russia and then being funneled up to Finland. You're thinking, that's interesting. Why are you ending all the way up there? Because Russia appears to be kind of motivating them to get up there, providing them with free bicycles and all these kind of different things, and then getting to cycle across the border in Finland and claim asylum. And similar sort of situation, Belarus, getting people to attack the border fences and climb over and blah, blah, blah. The idea is that they are trying to increase social strains there, but now we're hearing that this is happening in the UK, and the Mail is used to demonizing migrants and sort of blaming them kind of individually or as an amorphous mass. But actually here they're willing, and actually the Mail has been fairly anti-Russian over the last couple of years. They've actually been quite supportive of Ukraine, which is really good news. Putin is pushing migrants to Britain in an attempt to overwhelm its borders. Insiders claim Russia's aggravating Britain's migrant crisis to overwhelm border defences and sow division in the nation, security sources have claimed. Putin's government is believed to be providing fake documents, transport and even military escorts to smuggling gangs ferrying migrants across the channel. The threat of overwhelming migration poses... Helps if I can read. The threat overwhelming migration poses to national security is so fierce that this week NATO recognised it by allowing its members to count border protection as spending targets for the first time. I think part of that is going to be, how do we get up to 5%? And there's a lot of, I think we're going to find out quite a bit as time goes on, that there's a lot included in the 5% or the 3.5% and the 1.5% spending that is probably spending that would happen anyway. But it's just creative accountancy to make people happy that we're moving to 5%. A security source told The Sun hostile states and malign actors are using illegal migration to test borders, cause disruption and destabilise countries like Britain. That's exactly why NATO is now treating border protection as a core part of collective defence, because the lines between traditional military threats and national security are more blurred than ever. And actually, I don't necessarily disagree with that. I'm sure there is overlap, isn't there? So on and so forth. So I won't go into any more details, but that's absolutely fascinating and worrying. Now, I just want to talk about oil prices for a second, because they have dipped back down. I don't know if I've got any data on that. No. But I've shown you stuff over the last couple of days in Hits and Losses video, actually, where I often have some Russian economic stuff at the end of the videos. And the price of oil has gone back down into the 60s. And in fact, for Urals, it's in the 50s. And that's quite surprising, because people were expecting the Iran conflict to have had a much longer, greater effect, spiking the oil prices. Now, it's already gone through, this video from TLDR News Global has already gone through their first reason why that hasn't had such an effect, and they talk a lot about OPEC and this and that and whatnot. But this section, the second point here is, I think, really interesting, talking about the maturity of the market and whatnot.
But the second reason that oil prices haven't surged as much as we thought is that, well, the markets don't really think that Iran will actually disrupt supply. Ultimately, Iran doesn't export that much oil. It uses a lot of it domestically, and because of sanctions, most of what it does export goes to China anyway, something which isn't going to stop. Iran might instead disrupt global supply by either attacking oil facilities in neighbouring Middle Eastern countries, most notably Saudi Arabia, or by closing the Strait of Hormuz, where something like 20% of global oil passes. But while both of these things would have a material impact on global oil prices, they do feel unlikely. Iran doesn't want to upset its Arab neighbours, who have soured on Israel since the war in Gaza resumed, and have been remarkably supportive of Iran so far, at least rhetorically. And Iran wouldn't want to close the Strait of Hormuz either, because the countries that will be most affected include two of Iran's few remaining allies: Qatar, which exports LNG through the strait, and China, which uses it to import copious amounts of oil and LNG from the Middle East. This speaks to a more general dissimilarity between the current situation and that of the 70s or even the 2000s. Back then, most Middle Eastern oil was going to Europe or the US, so oil embargoes made sense. But today, thanks to the shale boom, the US is a net oil exporter, and China is actually the world's biggest importer. So disruption to Middle Eastern supply most directly harms China, not the West. This is one of the reasons that geopolitical turmoil in the Middle East has had less of an impact on global prices than it used to. In 1973, they quadrupled. In 1979, they tripled. But oil prices were relatively stable throughout the 90s and the early 2000s, despite the Gulf War and then the Iraq War. And in fact, the big moves in oil prices in the 2010s were mainly driven by OPEC decisions and the rise of shale in the US. But the other reason that geopolitical turmoil in the Middle East has had less of an impact on global prices, and the third reason on our list, is that the global oil market is just more mature. That means that there's more supply than there was previously, and the world no longer relies as much as it did on the Middle East. There's also more storage and a more developed financial system that allows traders to hedge against big price swings. And the economy as a whole is just less oil dependent than it used to be. In times of crisis, oil can be replaced by other energy sources, and the global economy's oil intensity, that is the amount of oil consumed per unit of GDP, has been falling steadily since the 80s. Nonetheless, this could all change.
It's really interesting because I was looking at some data about the amount of solar output, so solar energy China's producing, and it's just going through the roof. And in fact, if you look at the energy output in total for China, it's literally like this. And the US's energy output is like that. I mean, maybe they obviously just shows that China needs more and more and more. But also while they are firing up loads of coal-fired power stations, they're also like really embracing renewables in a way that the US is just trying to go backwards. Like the new policies that the Trump administration is trying to take on are so regressive in terms of energy. But anyway, it's a fascinating data swirling around.
Iran might well decide that closing the Strait of Hormuz is the only way to inflict pain on the US, and OPEC might join in, especially if Gulf states decide that they want to signal their disapproval for Trump. Thus far, however, it has been pretty underwhelming. Now, when talking about...
So, I thought that's pretty interesting. In fact, the oil price has now gone back down to what it was before that 12-day war. And could well keep going down. So that's really good for Ukraine and bad news for Russia. Now, Donald Trump has told President Erdogan he is ready to visit Turkey for potential talks with Putin, according to CNN Turk the other day. Erdogan then said that Trump is ready to join Zelensky-Putin talks in Turkey. Quote, "We will hold the necessary contact and, God willing, realise the meeting as soon as possible." In fact, we hear today, this is out today, that Russia is ready for a new round of talks with Kyiv. So that's Putin speaking, as where you just saw him speak. Only the time and place need to be agreed on, so it might be Turkey, might not be, claims the Kremlin patient. Will he show up himself or send his minions again, though? That's a question. Now, after the high-level US visit to Belarus led to the release of 14 prisoners, says the Kyiv Independent, observers have been left wondering what autocrat Lukashenko may have secured in return. This is exactly what I said the other day, which is, well, Keith Kellogg went and kind of schmoozed around with Lukashenko, and it looked very, I think, I just was quite uncomfortable with it, really. It was all kind of matey and pally. And then Lukashenko released 14 political prisoners, most of them foreigners, actually, but some Belarusians as well. And I guess if you were pro-Republican, pro-Trump, you'd be like, that's brilliant. Look at what Keith Kellogg has achieved. That's absolutely amazing. 14 prisoners released. But of course, it's quid pro quo, right? This is a negotiation. If he's releasing 14 prisoners, what's he getting in return? So the US are just full on into normalizing relationships with dictators. And I just think the US is going to be wanting to reduce sanctions, relieve the sanctions on Belarus, and just start doing deals with them, and then just essentially condoning dictatorial behavior. If you start bringing them on board, there is this idea of change by osmosis, and that's what Merkel tried to do with Putin, and he didn't. Like, Putin's Russia went the other way, so we couldn't. I forget what it's a rhyming German term for like changing people by bringing them in, and I'm all for that. But I just think with Putin and Lukashenko, no, they are dictators, and they will always be dictators, and we need to shun them and generate some kind of hopefully enough support within these countries to oust their leaders. But I don't know. There are arguments both ways, of course, for that. But one of the guys that was released was this chap here. And JNQ says, it's now clear why Lukashenko wanted this guy hidden away in torture tunnels. He's still passionate, yet emaciated after last week's release. The real Belarusian opposition member, who is called Siahe Tsikhanouski, calls on the world to stand up to Putin's pet dictator Lukashenko. So absolutely railing there, and interesting that he has been released. Okay, a bit of contradiction going on here. There's this Lieutenant General Grinkovich, who's been nominated by the US to lead NATO forces in Europe. He says, Senator, in this hearing, I think Ukraine can win. I think when your own homeland is threatened, you fight with a stubbornness that is hard for us to understand unless we've been there ourselves, which is fascinating because we haven't heard that from Americans. Anyway, at the same time, Secretary of State Marco Rubio says there is no military solution to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So you've got the military leader who's going to be in charge of the the American forces, NATO forces in Europe, and the NATO forces in general, actually, saying Ukraine can win. Marco Rubio saying they can't win. And then you've got Friedrich Merz saying there's no military solution to the conflict. He announced the 18th package of sanctions against Russia and called on the US to join in the economic pressure on Russia. So that's not going to happen. Merz said in order to end the war in Ukraine, it's necessary to significantly increase economic pressure on Russia. Now, I actually agree with that. Merz also said that in the next few days, the US Senate may vote for the Graham Bill, which provides for sanctions against buyers of Russian energy resources. Now, there is lots of talk about how much Trump and his administration are trying to water down that bill, trying to make it so that they can use it as leverage and so on and so forth. So I expect it would look very different to how it was originally envisaged. Now, just very quickly on Iran, the US has offered supposedly some deal with Iran where the $30 billion of aid for civilian nuclear program, no uranium enrichment allowed, takes place at Fordo. So they replace that with a nuclear power plant, I presume. The Gulf Arab allies are to cover the cost. So, you know, the money's not supposed to come from the US. It's like, yeah, we'll do that, so we won't pay for it. Or who's going to pay for it? Iran's frozen $6 billion is to be released as well. A new nuclear site to replace a bombed Fordo without enrichment capabilities. Now, some people are pointing out that when Obama and Biden suggested like monetary enticements for Iran, Republicans went absolutely ballistic at them. They spat the dummy. Like, what are you doing paying them to do X, Y, and Z? And by the way, that money was released frozen Iranian money. Like, it wasn't even US money. Now this, like, the US are like, have 30 billion, but I don't know, Qatar will pay for it or something. And then they're going to release 6 billion of frozen funds from, I think, South Korea, right? Because South Korea did some deal for energy or something sometime back, and then the US sanctions didn't allow South Korea to pay that money, so that's been frozen in South Korea, in South Korean banks. So the US here would say, right, that can finally go to Iran. But the idea is that just be wary of the double standards. I don't say this is a bad plan, by the way. I'm just like, I'm so fed up of saying, of hearing Republicans go, that's disgusting. You can't, what are you doing, Obama, trying to release this money? And as soon as Trump does it, it's like, oh, well done, Trump. That's great statescraft. That's just brilliant. Well done. Yeah, the carrot and stick, and you've done the stick, and now the carrot. Yeah, that's really clever. So hang on. You were going nuts about exactly the same thing previously. Anyway, there you go. So you can go and look at the details about the diplomatic efforts to restart these talks in various places. You can also find out about this is a previous 6 billion transfer from, I think, was this in Biden's time? I'm just trying to look for the timing of this one, but 2023. So this is Biden, and you know, people having to clarify. Look, this is where the $6 billion come from. It's frozen, and it actually comes from the original blah blah blah, and it's money that's owed to Iran, but we've kept it because of sanctions. So it's not like US taxpayers' money. But anyway, yeah, the Republicans still went mental about that. Right now, oh my goodness, right. A couple of things. I've been just really singing, not singing the alarm bells. I've been ringing the alarm bells about Palantir, right? So Palantir is this AI and tech company that's basically getting contracts all over the shop in the American government and the UK government. They got a contract with the NHS trying to get everyone's data. They have a thing, they have a contract to have files on every single migrant in the United States. And this is all like Stephen Miller involved, and it allows you to keep tabs on the migrants, and then et cetera, et cetera. Irrespective of anything else, that was really controversial anyway. It turns out that corruption. It turns out that Stephen Miller and big Palantir contracts for migrants, turns out that Stephen Miller has massive investments in Palantir. Oh, who knew? Turns out Voldemort is driven by hatred of immigrants and a gigantic conflict of interest. Recent reports show that top Trump aide Stephen Miller holds up to $250,000 of Palantir stocks. So there you go. And you can go and read about that in lots of places. Joe Walsh, who's a former Republican, says this is just so effing wrong. This kind of corruption should matter. Stephen Miller has financial stake in a company helping ICE with deportations report that they have their details at. Stephen Miller is evil, and he is also the person in charge of the United States. He is effectively the president of the United States, Stephen Miller, I would argue. Right, talking about the US, just a little bit on trade, because I think this will be important in the months to follow, because there will be a lag in indicators or just in economic activity in terms of the tariffs. So what happened when the tariffs were put on Liberation Day, up to that point and between the announcement and the actual enforcement of tariffs, the US went mad on buying stuff from abroad so they could buy stuff before the tariffs actually kicked in. It was like, right, there's going to be like 50% tariffs on this stuff we're getting from China. So we're going to buy a whole year's worth of stuff from China right now. So everyone front loaded the buying and importing. So there's huge amounts of import in the first quarter. And that made it look like there was loads of economic activity, and so you looked at the US economy and think, wow, people are spending lots of money all over the shop. This is really, there's nothing, tariffs aren't a problem. There's nothing wrong with the US economy. It's all very, very heated and whatnot. But then what you're going to have to do is look at quarter two to see, well, actually, then after the tariffs have been put in, what effect does that have on people actually? So it's what you're doing is you're just moving what you're going to buy within a given year to the front end of the year, which means that you're not going to buy it here and here and here, which means these are going to be much lower. And so you're not going to know about the effects of the tariffs that are put in here till quarter two, moving on to quarter three, that kind of thing. But also he keeps putting on tariffs and take them off, and it's just utter chaos. So, you know, you can't quite trust the figures because of that front loading. And also you can't trust, there are like, what is it? The hard and the soft data. So the hard data is that kind of trade data. The soft data is people's perceptions. And actually people's perceptions are being really informed by what news they're reading and stuff. So I was listening to an economist the other day saying you can't even trust the soft data either, because everyone's just got skewed ideas of what's going on. And when you're asked about whether you think the economy is good, right, you would just, if you're a Trumpian Republican, you will say, of course it's good, the economy's brilliant. And if you're a Democrat, you say, no, it's terrible. And so all that happens is the soft data just goes along party lines. You can't even trust that. So you can't trust the hard data in quarter one, as in it's kind of skewed, and you can't trust the soft data. So if you're trying to say, is the US in trouble because of the tariffs? The answer is, don't know yet, but the predictions would be probably. So anyway, what's fascinating is that's the reason for putting tariffs on is to stop the trade deficit. He said he was going to do reciprocal tariffs. He didn't. He was calculating the tariffs based on trade deficits with each country around the world using AI to do that. Now, because Peter Navarro told him to do that. So that's what happened. Now, and Peter Navarro knew what he's talking about because he wrote a book on this where he was referencing the great economist Ron Varro. And Ron Varro is Peter Navarro's, or Ron, yeah, something like Ron Varro is just an anagram of Navarro, and he was referencing himself to, anyway, don't trust Peter Navarro, but he's a person who's behind all the tariffs. Okay, so where am I? So you've got all of this. You had tariffs that were being implemented to onshore the work in the US. So what this was aiming to do is to reduce the trade deficit, which is we want more stuff being exported than we are importing. We don't want to import stuff from everywhere else. We want to make it ourselves, and then we want to export it. So we put on these tariffs to do that. So the aspirations were The objective was to reduce the deficit, the trade deficit. Unfortunately, the trade deficit has surged. It's literally gone the other way. This is how insanely bad everything is looking. So the Commerce Department's Census Bureau on Thursday reported that the international trade in goods increased by about 11% in May as exports decreased. So they're actually decreasing exports because they've got a trade war with everyone else. No one else wants to buy American stuff, and they're reciprocal tariffs and all sorts, which means that they're struggling to sell their stuff abroad as people like Canada are looking to Europe are looking to Canada. Let's cut out the US, and you're struggling to export, and they're still buying lots of things in ahead of, well, actually it's remained relatively unchanged, which would be still buying lots of stuff in, depending on what people are predicting with future tariffs. A sign that Trump's tariff strategy has been a colossal failure, says this source. Now, Newsweek has reported that US trade deficit surges despite the tariffs. 11% trade gap increased by about 11% as exports decrease and imports remain relatively unchanged. It's all looking a bit challenging, and you can go and look into that. Now, what's even worse is that the GDP went down in quarter one, but it went down not by the 0.1% I think they were predicting. It went down by 0.5%. So if you look at this this chart, you can see that the GDP growth in each of these quarters from quarter one in 2023. So after you got over the whole COVID thing, the American economy was looking absolutely fantastic, performing much stronger than other comparable nations. Trump took over, had a trade war, whacked on all the tariffs, and GDP shrunk 5%. The deficit is grown 11%. GDP shrunk 0.5%. That is not too cool. In the previous year, it grew 2.8%. So that's a massive difference. And in fact, here we have some other indicators that are not good. So core inflation rate rose to 2.7% in May, more than expected. Income plunge. So here's another one. I don't know if I've got any details on that. The average income plunged 0.4%. And that's the first month-on-month decrease in that in 4 years. That is bad. That's a bad sign. The GDP is down 0.5%. But of course, it's going to be spun. But it's, personal income there. That's not looking good. The indicators are bad, and Trump will try and spin this. But, right, just other random things. So, Canadian national has died in ICE custody. Someone else who was whipped off the streets, no doubt, as a Canadian has died. I wonder if that's going to produce any more bad blood between the two nations. And watch out for this one. So, Dominion, over the voting thing, took Fox News to court and won $787 million. Gavin Newsom has just taken Fox News to court today. He's suing Fox News for $787 million. He's saying basically the same thing. You lied about me. You lied about the phone call. Trump is defamation, blah, blah, blah. Watch that one. So you've got the governor of the fourth biggest economy in the world, California, taking Fox News to court. And I have long said the only way Fox News doesn't keep lying to the world is you take them to court. Litigation, sadly, is the only way. If the government's not going to regulate, you've got to litigate. And the only way to stop these news stations from lying and lying and lying is suing and suing and suing. I was hoping that Dominion and Smartmatic, those two court cases, would stop Fox News from lying. It didn't. Maybe Gavin Newsom, if he wins in that one, over it was over the phone call where Trump said, I phoned him. Gavin Newsom said, no, you didn't phone me. And then Trump said, yes, I did. And then Jesse Waters then edited his piece to essentially make it look like Trump had phoned him, but he hadn't phoned him in the last 24 hours, and et cetera, et cetera. It's all to do with that, and probably lots more to do with defamation and whatnot. So that's pretty interesting. And just random, I'm just giving you random stuff, not to do with Ukraine here, but just some things to keep you thinking over the weekend. So I find this interesting. So Substack apparently started as a kind of right-wing thing, an alternative for people sick of woke and the mainstream media. But at least according to this person, I wasn't aware of that. Liberals read, conservatives watch TV. This is interesting. As it turned out, there is no real right-wing constituency for reading. Substack became dominated by leftists because they're the literate ones. Okay, that is quite controversial. So take that with a pinch of salt. However, data here suggests that the biggest readers on Substack, the biggest Substack sources are left wing by quite a margin, in a way that when you look at Twitter and the biggest accounts on Twitter and the biggest accounts on YouTube, I think some of these other places are right wing. So it's interesting that the video versus the written word, there is a discernible difference between right wing and left wing. I just thought that's interesting. I don't know, that means that I don't know what that means yet. I'll have to think about it, but it has something to do with liberal intelligentsia and something like that. I don't know. Can you draw education inferences from that? I don't know. Probably a bit controversial, but I just sort of throw that one in there. And I just thought, because he has been nominated by 2 people in Congress for the Nobel Peace Prize, I just thought I'd leave you with this nice bit of a gag here. Hey, Donnie, says Obama, want to hear a joke? Nobel Peace Prize. I don't get it. That's right, bitch. You don't. You don't get it. You don't get a Nobel Peace Prize. You don't, because he's not going. He shouldn't, like. He's not going to get the Nobel. He wants a Nobel Peace Prize. He's not going to get it. So, like, when he said, "Do you get it?" and he said, "I don't get it," like the joke, but actually he meant no Nobel Peace Prize. It's a joke. I thought it was funny.